This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on nation states and the modern development of human organizations since about the 1600s. So with human organization, when we look back on the Western side of things, so in Western philosophy, people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle always advocated that the best way that you could organize was through small city-states. Now, why was this the case? Well, their argument was this was the best way really to protect minorities from the centralization of power. Now, when I say minorities, you might be thinking of the way we think of minorities today, meaning racial groups or gender groups or sexual orientation groups. That's not what I mean. For people like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, a minority at that time period were landowners. The fear was that landowners, because they possessed the scarcity of land, could be overtaken by the huge mob of people who, if they got their passions riled up by some leader, could come in and steal their land. So the idea was to organize people in small city-states so that you could really provide protection to these minorities. Now, why was this the case? Well, the reason why you could protect minorities was that you wouldn't be able to have, like in a large country or an empire, the ability for a dictator to rise who could steal all power. Instead, if you could keep things small and local, then there would be various groups of people that could check and balance each other. Now, most human civilizations were formed eventually around empires. They really didn't follow this advice. They eventually formed empires. But even when they formed empires, the empires were there for military purposes, policing, trade, and eventually really the main goal was stability. Also, empires were used for large-scale surpluses of agriculture, and that then created large population growth. So when we look at Europe, Europe had both a handicap, and that handicap eventually became a strength. After the fall of the Roman Empire in 496 AD, Europe never again would regain its centralization. After this time period, there was an attempt. There was a king coming out of the Germanic states called Charlemagne, who attempted with the Treaty of Verdun to establish centralization again. Instead, what this eventually created are somewhat of the boundaries of what we see today for the way that Europe looks like. So the countries of like Spain and France and England got established out of the Treaty of Verdun. Now, initially, this became one of Europe's greatest handicaps because they couldn't really arise and compete with countries like China. But it eventually would become Europe's greatest strength due to competition. Now, during the post-classical era, it was weak. And the reason why it was weak probably is because at that time period, people practiced an agricultural economy with limited merchant class competition. So under an agricultural economy, whoever had a centralized empire tended to have the greatest strength. But once we moved into the exploration period with merchant classes competing against each other, all these different European countries would compete with each other and innovate. It became a strength for Europe. So Europe's nation states, how did they arise? Well, Europe suffered, just like all the countries suffered at this time, back in about the 1300s, 1400s, from the Black Plague. The Black Plague led to a significant decline in the labor supply. So in response to that, when the Black Plague was finally gone, landowners raised wages in order to attract peasant labor. But eventually this led to such an inflation of wages that landowners could no longer afford this. So they pushed peasants off of the land. Well, where did these peasants go to? Well, they went to cities. When they went to cities, they began forming trades and merchant classes. And this is where we're going to start to see countries starting to come together. So, for example, Spain. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella joined their kingdoms together of Spain into a nation, and they saw the opportunity now to start doing investments in order to grow their nation or their kingdom. Now, where are they getting all these investments from? Well, from two places. One, from these cities, which they can tax, and two, the merchant class that arises, they can have go out and do exploration. During exploration, Christopher Columbus went to the different republics and kingdoms of Italy, and when he went to all these different republics and kingdoms, he was turned down by every Italian prince or governor in order to do a trip that he believed going out west would connect Europe much more quickly with China and with India. But it was Spain that had the governmental desire to place an investment in this new trade route. By doing this, Spain raised up merchants to a new level, and merchants then became a source for kings' tax revenues. And that's going to be very important for Western Europe. It's really going to distinguish Western Europe in contrast to Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. Because what ends up happening is as merchants become a source for the king's tax revenues, they gain more power. And this means that they can now challenge the king and start to create more representation. And so eventually what we're going to see is an expanded amount of representation, especially within England in their parliament. Now, the original representation of the parliament came long before this. It was established by the nobles who actually forced King John to establish a parliament, but that was the upper house. What we're now going to get is a much more expanded lower house in the parliament and much more power to the merchants and the middle class. And that leads up to the economic system of mercantilism. As you might remember, the way the economic system of mercantilism worked was by nation state organizations. Mother countries in Europe would send out explorers and then the military in order to get resources. Resources were then brought back to the mother country for manufacturing, and the government tried to create a balance of trade with other countries to expand the nation. Eventually, mercantilism gave way to the Industrial Revolution. European governments used the finances and investments from the Industrial Revolution, from colonies in order to establish the basis to the Industrial Revolution. Once European governments gained this economic advantage, they then began to advocate for notions of free trade. Militaries were advanced to protect trade routes and enforce the open trade that was supposed to take place between different countries. So this is where we're going to start to see a change that takes place, and it takes place in the 1790s with the Ming Dynasty. Lord Macartney from England, as free trade is getting going, goes out to China and demands the emperor in the Ming Dynasty, Qianlong, needs to open up free trade. Now the Chinese looked at this request and basically thought it was a joke and kicked Lord Macartney out of China. But with only in a period of about 40 years, the English are going to gain a dominance that will allow them to force the Chinese to start opening up to free trade. So what had changed in this time? Well, the English had started to establish a much stronger navy, especially a navy that was based upon steam. Now, at the time, there was an imbalance of trade in which Chinese silk was selling at a much higher rate in England than English tea was selling within China. So England began to open up trade with China through the opium trade. And that opium trade really caught on because it was a drug and because it became addictive for Chinese people, especially in the port cities. At that point, there was two possibilities the Chinese could have gone with. And this is going to sound a lot like our drug war today. One side advocated to just open up that trade and to allow people to do these drugs and then to tax it and provide ways to rehabilitate the population. The other side said that this was moral corruption. They needed to shut down this trade as soon as possible, and so they did. The Chinese minister Lin Zexu tried to shut down the trade over this issue of moral corruption. The English response from Queen Victoria was to claim that the Chinese were barbarians because they were not protecting open and free trade. Yet notice the rhetoric here. Open and free trade meant at this time period that the Chinese would not open up to the opium trade, a trade in drugs. So eventually China and England went to war in what were known as the Opium Wars. Now at the end of the first one, a treaty was called the Treaty of Nanjing, in which China accepted the loss. They opened up 5 ports, lowered their tariffs, and paid for damage to the war. What's really important about this is what we're seeing here is a switch overall in world history. Up until now, the Chinese have been dominant. What we are now going to see in the 1830s is a switch in dominance as China loses its dominance because of English military power. Similar thing happens with the Japanese at this time. In the 1850s, the Japanese were led by the isolationist Tokugawa regime, which had been in power for about 300 years. At that point in 1853, Commodore William Perry from the United States went to the Japanese government and demanded that they open up to free trade. Basically, the demand was you either open up to free trade or we're coming back in a year and we will force you to open up to free trade. Now, what was the U.S. really interested in here? Well, the U.S. was interested in pressuring China to open up to trade, and they saw Japan as sort of like a stepping stone on the way to get out to China. If they could get Japan to open up, they could put pressure on China to then open up to free trade. So Commodore Perry forced Japan to open up to world trade or be conquered, and the Japanese eventually accepted. However, Japan's response was not a quick one. Japan went through an internal civil war over this issue that was eventually won not by the progressives but by the Sacho Traditionalists. Now, the reason why I say that it was won by the Traditionalists is that you might think that they would revert back to the notion of isolationism, but they didn't. Instead, the Sacho Traditionalists established a new dynasty called the Meiji. It was also known as the Meiji Restoration, in which the emperor was given absolute power with an advisory parliament. Now, think about that for just a second. This sounds in many ways very progressive. The Meiji Emperor is establishing a parliament, and the parliament was very much like in its structure the European parliament. In fact, many Japanese went out and they studied the parliaments of Europe. However, the actual implementation was very classically Asian, because notice here what the parliament's job was. The parliament was not there in order to pass laws, the parliament was to advise the Meiji Emperor. Well, if the Meiji Emperor has absolute power and the parliament is there to advise, what does this remind us of? Probably Chinese legalism. Now, don't get me wrong here, this is Japan, so Japan is not going to implement or see itself as Chinese, but notice that the roots of this philosophy very much come out of the classical Chinese philosophies. Now, Japan had always had a problem. Japan's problem was the local governors, or what were called daimyos, had always been in charge in the local areas and fragmented Japan into numerous different city-states. So the Meiji Emperor had to find out a way to centralize all these people under his control, and he did this by providing them an incentive. If the daimyos moved into the capital, they could become a part of this advisory parliament. On top of that, the Meiji Emperor also provided a stick as an incentive as well. He used taxes on these farmlands to try and get people out of the farmlands into the cities. And with those taxes, he both created an industrialized navy and he attracted people towards the cities. After that, Japan would win two major wars, one against the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, and then another devastating loss for the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War in 1906. Now, this brings us then to the big difference at this time period between two different groups across the world. One is traditionalists. Traditionalists argue that society is best organized around faith, social order, and hierarchy. For traditionalists, they tend to believe that humans are flawed by something, whether it be sin in the monotheistic tradition, self-interest, or power seeking. In the traditionalist viewpoint, agriculture is preferred because it forces people into familial relationships, classes, and strong authority. So we can think across the world. Confucianism, which is the Indian caste system, the European great chain of being, the Aztec form of families. Basically, everywhere across the world, traditionalists believe agriculture would provide a family basis which will allow for relationships that were strongly based on social order. Faith and religious leaders in this belief system provide for a justification to stability flowing from this problem of human nature. Humans tend towards corruption, so you need faith and religion to keep us in check. On the opposite side are the modernists. Now, modernists arise somewhere after the time period of the 1700s out of the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. Modernists argued that science, rationality, and secular economic growth was really best. For them, human beings are self-interested, but our self-interest can lead us, if we use the right methods of science and rationality, into more and more progress. For modernists, the nation-state provides a central government that would help to guide this process. The nation-state can invest in things like transportation, communication, and education, and the nation-state can then provide for a centralized cultural organizational scheme that gives sort of the boundaries or rules for everybody to move forward in economic growth. One problem in all of this is the outgrowth of social Darwinism. So on its surface, I'm sure that rationality and science sound really good, and for a long time, a lot of people believed that was the best way to do things. However, science eventually led to a new philosophy called social Darwinism. According to social Darwinism, people can be categorized according to their racial characteristics. So why does this become so important with governments? One of the problems governments have always faced and nation states face is how do you assimilate a whole bunch of different groups into the nation state? For example, Russia had to assimilate tribal groups from Siberia. South Africa had to assimilate a group of people called the Zulu tribes. The US had to assimilate Native American tribes. So one solution was a racial solution of social Darwinism that defined certain groups as superior, others as inferior, based upon your racial inheritance. What kind of racial pool did you come out of genetically? And this arises out of the age of science, and it arises out of the age of the growth of the nation state. And this eventually leads to some severe consequences in the 20th century of what we call genocide. Now, this is what's interesting about genocide. We've always had man's inhumanity to man. We can look throughout human history and you will see horrible wars and horrible brutality. In fact, in the 20th century, we've actually seen a decline in wars and violence ever since World War II. So that's kind of the good news for us in comparison to rest of world history. However, a strange new phenomenon arises in the 20th century we haven't seen, and that is something called genocide. A genocide is defined as the attempt to eliminate an entire group of people based upon their racial identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, or some other type of identity. It's only in the 20th century that we really see this attempt to get rid of an entire group of people based upon those categories. For example, the Ottoman Empire had been collapsing since the 1860s. In the late 1800s, a group of people took over called the Young Turks. They took over in Anatolia, and they tried to create a modern nation state. Now, originally, the Young Turks published decrees based upon the notion of human rights, modernism, science, secular progress. But during World War I, Russia had been pitted against Germany, and Russia ended up siding with the Christian Armenians. Well, who are the Armenians? The Armenians were a minority group that lived within Turkey. And what the Turks did was the Turks believed that the Armenians had allied themselves with the Russians. The Turks had allied themselves with Germany. And so the Young Turks classified the Armenians as an internal cancer that threatened the Turkish nationality, and then they tried to wipe them out. Now, this is classical types of ways of doing genocide. You take a group of people and you completely dehumanize them by comparing them to either a disease, a rodent, or an insect, and then you claim that they are somehow an internal threat to the empire and that we have to get rid of all of them. And we see this, of course, in the most famous case of the Jewish Holocaust. In the case of the Jewish Holocaust, the Germans had lost World War I, and they were completely humiliated at the Treaty of Versailles. At the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies had forced Germany into paying back basically everything for World War I, and they also took huge amounts of land away from Germany. So coming out of that, Adolf Hitler eventually blamed the loss on Jewish leadership. The claim was that the Republic at the time of World War I was being led by Jewish leaders who intentionally wanted to sink Germany, and so they basically destroyed Germany from within. But the definition of the attack was racial, and it pointed to Jews, again, as a contagion, as a cancer on the nation, and even compared them to rats. And eventually, Adolf Hitler believed that by getting rid of the Jewish people, he could eventually create something called the German Lebensraum, or the Greater Germany. So notice what Hitler is doing here, a very classical notion of comparing Jewish people to a racially inferior type of animal or insect or even a disease, and then trying to get rid of them completely. So this brings back now to this issue of what a nation state is. And one of the downsides of a nation state are known as the rationality of a nation state. Nation states, which are the way we do things today, have a huge upside. What they do is they use science and rationality in order to create a modern organizational system. In many ways, it's a very positive thing. Nation states allow for massive amounts of free trade. They allow for investments into science and education. Nation states allow us to conglomerate huge amounts of people under similar types of beliefs. Here in the United States, we do that under the belief of the Declaration of Independence, natural rights, and the Constitution. However, the nation state has also had an incredibly dark side, and its dark side depends a lot on the categorization of people. What oftentimes happens is people who are of different ethnic groups have to be brought under this similar bent so we can have economic progress. And this has led into things like racial categorization, and it has led into things like genocide. This means that if we want to try to create some kind of similar way for industrialization, oftentimes we can see an oppression of the minority. So the real question that we have at the end is, what is the nation state itself? Has the nation state brought more positives or more negatives? How do we weigh this out? And how do we make sure, even if the nation state has more positives, that we don't lead down the track of taking minority groups and trying to force them into one type of category that could lead into a type of racial hierarchy?